The penthouse overlooking the Boston skyline was a masterclass in modern perfection, right down to the crystal wine glasses resting on the cold marble island. But beside Dominic's untouched Cabernet lay Zara's unlocked phone, its screen suddenly lighting up with a midnight notification from Michael W. that simply read, "Is he asleep yet? I can still taste you." The empire they had built together was quietly fracturing, a devastating web of deceit spun right beneath his nose while he poured their evening wine. If these fragile, dangerous moments of hidden truths and shattered vows draw you in, stay with me to see how this unfolds. The rushing sound of the rainfall showerhead echoed from the master bathroom, a steady rhythmic hiss that usually brought Dominic a sense of domestic peace. Tonight it sounded like static. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Boston penthouse, a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch warming in his grip. 70 floors down the city was a sprawling grid of amber streetlights and endless ambition. They had just returned from the annual Reed Pharmaceuticals Gala. Zara had been radiant, working the ballroom in a backless emerald gown, her arm looped securely through his. They were the golden couple of the biotech world, the perfect partnership. Dominic took a slow sip, the amber liquid burning a trail down his throat. He turned his gaze back to the kitchen island. Zara had left her phone face up on the marble counter plugged into the charger. She rarely did that. She was a woman who slept with her devices securely tucked under her pillow, forever chained to the demands of the board. But tonight she was exhausted, fueled by 3 glasses of vintage champagne and the high of a successful quarterly report. The screen lit up. In the dimmed lights of the living room, the sudden glare was impossible to ignore. Dominic hadn't intended to look. After 5 years of marriage, he trusted her implicitly. But the notification banner sat there stark and unapologetic against her lock screen wallpaper, a photo of the two of them in Aspen. "Michael W., is he asleep yet? I can still taste you in the elevator." Dominic stopped breathing. The silence in the apartment seemed to instantly calcify, growing heavy and suffocating. He didn't drop his glass. He didn't shout. His heart simply executed a slow, agonizing dive into his stomach. He stepped closer to the island, his leather shoes making no sound against the hardwood. He stared at the glowing pixels until the screen finally went black, but the words remained burned into his retinas. Michael Williams, the newly appointed VP of Acquisitions at Reed. A man who had shaken Dominic's hand less than 2 hours ago, complimenting Zara on her keynote speech, with a smile that now in hindsight carried the sickening weight of an inside joke. A second buzz vibrated against the marble. "Michael W., wear the emerald dress for me on Tuesday. Just the dress." Dominic closed his eyes. The physical pain was immediate, a sharp, twisting ache in the center of his chest. His mind frantically tried to build a defense to find a rational explanation, but the sheer vulgarity of the messages dismantled every excuse. The subtle, lingering glances between Zara and Michael during board meetings. The sudden, inexplicable, late-night crisis management sessions. The way she had subtly pulled away from him over the last 6 months, citing the crushing pressure of the FDA approvals. It wasn't pressure. It was a choice. The water in the bathroom shut off. Dominic's eyes snapped open. He looked at the phone, then out at the glittering skyline. The instinct to storm into the bedroom, to hurl the phone at her feet and demand answers flared hot in his blood. But Dominic Beaumont was not a man of reckless emotion. He was a strategist. He understood that in the ruthless ecosystem they inhabited, losing your temper meant losing your leverage. "Dom," Zara's voice called out from the bedroom, soft and laced with feigned domestic fatigue. "Are you coming to bed?" Dominic carefully set his scotch down next to her phone. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his hands trembling only slightly. The man who had walked into this penthouse an hour ago was dead. The man who remained felt nothing but the freezing, quiet clarity of absolute betrayal. "In a minute," Dominic called back, his voice remarkably steady. "Just finishing my drink." Dominic stood perfectly still until the bedroom went entirely silent. He waited another 20 minutes, listening to the subtle shift of the high-rise settling against the Boston wind. When he was certain Zara had fallen into the deep, heavy sleep that always followed her corporate triumphs, he finally moved. He bypassed the master suite entirely and headed straight for the home office. The room was a shrine to their shared ambition: dual mahogany desks, shelves lined with medical journals, and glass cases displaying pharmaceutical awards. It was here, surrounded by the physical manifestations of their success, that Dominic began to methodically dismantle his life. He opened his laptop, the harsh blue light washing over his tense features. He didn't just need proof of the affair. In the circles they moved in, infidelity was a messy emotional distraction easily buried by expensive publicists. He needed structural leverage. As a founding partner of Reed Pharmaceuticals, Dominic still retained access to the deepest, most secure layers of the company's internal network. He worked with a chilling mechanical precision, his fingers flying across the quiet keyboard. He bypassed the standard servers and dug into the restricted financial architectures Zara thought he ignored. He downloaded offshore transaction logs, preliminary and heavily doctored clinical trial reports for their highly anticipated cardiac drug, and hidden strings of internal communications between Zara and Michael that circumvented official company oversight. The data downloading onto his screen told a story far more damning than cheap hotel receipts. It was a blueprint of systematic corporate fraud and profound moral bankruptcy orchestrated by the woman currently sleeping just down the hall. He transferred every file onto a pair of encrypted, high-capacity, solid-state drives, slipping them deep into his coat pocket. The physical act of packing took less than 10 minutes. He pulled a single dark canvas duffel bag from the guest closet. He didn't pack the bespoke Italian suits Zara had selected for him, nor the expensive chronographs she bought to mark their corporate milestones. He packed heavy denim plain shirts, a thick coat, and his passport. He was systematically discarding the skin of Dominic Beaumont, the wealthy, oblivious husband. Before leaving, Dominic walked back to the kitchen island. Zara's phone was still plugged in the screen, dark, hoarding its ugly little secrets. Beside it sat his empty crystal tumbler. He reached into his pocket and slid his wedding ring off his finger. The heavy platinum band felt suddenly alien, a shackle he had willingly, blindly worn for 5 years. He didn't leave a melodramatic note. He didn't shatter the glass against the wall to wake her. He simply set the ring down on the cold marble directly beside her phone. The silent juxtaposition was the only message she would ever need. The private elevator ride down to the garage was the longest ascent of his life. With every floor, the digital display counted down a piece of his past, fractured and drifted away. When the steel doors finally slid open to the subterranean quiet, the concrete air felt freezing against his lungs. He didn't take the silver Porsche. He walked to the far corner and unlocked an older, unassuming sedan he had owned since before the company went public, a car Zara had always quietly despised. As he merged onto the empty, rain-slicked interstate, the glittering Boston skyline began to shrink in the rearview mirror. The amber streetlights smeared into a blurred, distant memory against the wet glass. Dominic gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and drove into the dark. The executive boardroom of Reed Pharmaceuticals was designed to intimidate, a cavernous space of brushed steel and soundproof glass hovering 60 floors above the Boston traffic. Zara stood at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture immaculate in a sharp-tailored ivory suit. It had been exactly 3 weeks since she woke up in an empty penthouse, the only evidence of her marriage's demise, a cold platinum ring resting precisely beside her phone. There had been no angry text messages, no drunken voicemails, no lawyers demanding immediate asset freezes. Just a suffocating, absolute silence. After an initial terrifying morning of anticipating an explosion that never came, Zara had felt something entirely different wash over her relief. Dominic has always been the visionary heart of this company. Zara set her tone a masterclass in rehearsed, dignified sorrow. She held the gaze of the senior shareholders gathered around the table. But the relentless pressure of our upcoming FDA filings has taken a profound toll on him. After extensive private discussions, we decided it was imperative for Dominic to take an indefinite sabbatical to prioritize his mental health. It was a flawless execution of corporate public relations. In the high-stakes environment of biotechnology, burnout was a protected status, a term that elicited sympathetic nods while effectively shutting down any invasive probing. To the board, Dominic Beaumont was a brilliant but exhausted founder, stepping back. To Zara, he was a coward who had conveniently surrendered his throne without spilling a single drop of blood. Across the polished wood, Michael Williams steepled his fingers, his expression suitably solemn for the investors. But beneath the mask of professional concern, his dark eyes locked onto Zara's, carrying the heavy shared thrill of a bloodless coup. He had already been voted in to manage Dominic's operational duties as an interim measure. It was a transition of power orchestrated so smoothly that the company's stock price had actually risen 2 points at the morning bell. As the meeting adjourned and the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the last departing board member, the artificial tension in the room instantly evaporated. Michael stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, loosening his dark silk tie. Zara moved to the wet bar, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal. The sound echoed in the massive, empty room. "You played them perfectly," Michael murmured, his voice dropping an octave as she handed him a glass. His fingers intentionally brushed against hers, a slow, possessive friction that sent a familiar heat rushing through her veins. Zara took a slow sip, turning to look out at the sprawling urban grid that now felt entirely hers to command. She felt no lingering guilt over the ring left on the marble counter, no mourning for the 5 years of shared history. In her mind, Dominic's silent retreat was the ultimate confirmation of what she had secretly believed for months. He lacked the ruthless killer instinct required to rule an empire of this magnitude. He possessed the intellect, but not the stomach, for the dark, necessary compromises of their industry. "He made it easy," Zara replied quietly, her reflection faintly visible in the thick window glass. "I expected a war. I expected him to try and tear the board in half. Instead, he just evaporated." Michael stepped closer, his presence a warm, heavy shadow behind her. "Because he knew he couldn't win against you. He folded." Zara smiled, a thin, sharp curve of her lips. They stood side by side, bathed in the high-altitude sunlight of their own arrogance. They felt untouchable, kings of a glass castle built on falsified data and shattered vows, entirely blind to the fact that they had not buried a broken man. They had simply given a master strategist the time and the shadows he needed to build a guillotine. The rain in Seattle was not like the brief, violent storms of the East Coast. It was a relentless gray mist that seeped into the bones, perfectly matching the suffocating isolation of the last 6 months. Dominic sat in the corner booth of a dying diner off Interstate 5, nursing a mug of bitter, over-roasted coffee. He looked different. The custom-tailored Italian suits were gone, replaced by a dark wool sweater and a weather-beaten canvas jacket. The sharp corporate edge of his jawline was softened by a shadow of a beard, but his eyes were entirely changed. They held the hollow, freezing depth of a man who had survived a house fire by standing perfectly still in the flames. The diner door chimed, cutting through the low hum of the commercial refrigerators. Chris Baker walked in, shaking the dampness from his worn parka. He looked older than 32, his posture curved by the invisible weight of professional ruin. 2 years ago, Chris had been Reed Pharmaceuticals' most promising lead researcher. Then he discovered the severe cardiac anomalies in Zara's prize flagship drug. When he refused to alter his clinical data to fit her aggressive timeline, Zara hadn't just fired him. She had systematically blacklisted him across the East Coast biotech corridor, burying his reputation under layers of NDA threats and whispered smears. Chris slid into the cracked vinyl booth opposite Dominic. He didn't order anything. He just stared at the man who had been the silent, complicit half of the empire that crushed him. "When you sent that encrypted email, I thought it was a trap," Chris said, his voice grating and defensive. "Or a sick joke. Dominic Beaumont hiding out in a Washington zip code. Why am I here, Dominic?" Dominic didn't offer a polite preamble. He didn't apologize for his former blindness to his wife's ruthlessness. Apologies meant nothing to men who had lost everything. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small silver flash drive on the scarred Formica table. "You were right about the synthesized compounds, Chris," Dominic said softly. "The toxicity markers in phase 2 were real. She hid them. And I have the unaltered data right here." Chris stared at the small metal rectangle as if it were a live grenade. His breath hitched a sudden, sharp intake of air. The vindication was a ghost returning to haunt him. "She buried it," Chris whispered, his eyes flicking up to Dominic with a mix of anger and disbelief. "She buried it, and you let her." "I didn't know," Dominic replied, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity or defensiveness. "I was looking the other way, at a lot of things." The unspoken weight of that admission hung in the damp air between them. Chris studied Dominic's face, searching for the arrogant, untouchable executive he remembered. Instead, he found only a terrible, absolute clarity. Chris slowly realized this wasn't an act of corporate whistleblowing. This was a man building an executioner's block. This drive also has your original clean baseline. Dominic continued, his tone steady, hypnotic in its certainty. The one you said could revolutionize the receptor targeting without the cardiac side effects. I have the seed capital, completely untraceable to Boston. We are going to finish your research. We are going to patent the clean drug. Chris swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly as he hovered his fingers over the flash drive. Reed will bury us in litigation before we even clear phase 1. Zara has the best lawyers on the seaboard. She will destroy us. She can't destroy a ghost, Chris, Dominic said, taking a slow sip of his terrible coffee. She thinks she's already won. She thinks I am a broken man. That's her blind spot. By the time she realizes we exist, your drug will render her entire empire obsolete. Chris looked out the rain-streaked window, watching the endless stream of brake lights bleeding red onto the wet highway. The fear was still there, a heavy knot in his stomach, but beneath it, a dormant spark of defiance finally ignited. He slowly pulled the silver drive across the table, slipping it deep into his pocket. The pact was sealed in the quiet, steady rhythm of the Seattle rain. The fluorescent lights of the leased laboratory hummed with a low, sterile vibration. It was a nondescript concrete building in a forgotten industrial park on the outskirts of Seattle, light years away from the glass and steel cathedrals of Boston's biotech district. Outside, the perpetual dampness of the Pacific Northwest clung to the window panes. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. Chris Baker sat slumped in front of a bank of monitors, his eyes bloodshot behind thick-rimmed glasses. He had barely slept in 3 days. On the screen, a complex 3D molecular rendering slowly rotated against a black background. Dominic stood behind him, a silent shadow in a dark wool sweater. He held a thick stack of printed documents, the final patent application. Run the toxicity simulation one more time, Dominic said, his voice a quiet command in the stillness of the lab. Chris sighed, a sound of sheer exhaustion, but his fingers instinctively danced across the keyboard. Dom, this is the 50th run. The binding affinity is stable. The off-target myocardial effects are practically non-existent. It's clean. It is completely, undeniably clean. They watched in silence as the progress bar crept across the bottom of the screen. When the green pass indicator finally illuminated the room with a soft emerald glow, neither man cheered. The gravity of what they had just accomplished was too immense for celebration. They had successfully synthesized the very compound Zara had claimed was impossible, a cardiovascular therapeutic that delivered the life-saving benefits of Reed's highly profitable flagship drug without the devastating, hidden cellular decay that Chris had originally discovered. Dominic looked down at the paperwork in his hands. This wasn't just a medical breakthrough. It was a weapon of mass corporate destruction. Are the shell companies layered properly? Chris asked, rubbing his temples. The scientific hurdle was cleared, but the legal minefield was just beginning. 3 layers deep, Dominic replied, stepping toward the small metal desk in the corner. Registered in Delaware, routed through a holding firm in Zurich, funded by private equity that traces back to a blind trust. When the patent office registers this tomorrow morning, the applicant will be listed as Aegis Therapeutics. It won't trigger a single keyword alert in Reed's legal department. Dominic uncapped a fountain pen. He stared at the signature line. For 2 years, he had lived as a ghost. He had shed his former identity, allowed his wife to spin a narrative of his mental collapse, and watched from the shadows as she and Michael paraded their stolen, fraudulent empire. He had traded his pride, his marriage, and his name for time. Now time was up. The nib of the pen scratched smoothly against the heavy paper. It was a small, quiet sound, yet in Dominic's mind, it echoed like the unsheathing of a blade. He signed the documents, finalizing the legal existence of the entity that would end his wife's reign. So we file, Chris murmured, looking back at the glowing molecular structure on his screen, a mix of awe and terror in his voice. And then what? We just wait. No, Dominic said softly, sliding the documents into a heavy manila envelope and sealing it shut. We don't wait anymore. We move out of the dark. We let them see the ghost. He walked over to the reinforced window, gazing out at the wet, empty parking lot. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a chilling clarity in the night air. The explosive device was officially armed. All that remained was to walk it into the ballroom. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, silk evening gowns, and the quiet, dangerous hum of biotech venture capitalism. This was the Global Innovator Summit, the apex of the pharmaceutical calendar. Zara Ahmed stood near the center of the room holding a flute of champagne, radiating the absolute authority of a queen in her undisputed domain. She wore a striking crimson dress that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers above. Michael Williams stood half a step behind her, a proprietary hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They were the undisputed center of gravity. For the past 2 hours, Zara had flawlessly fielded questions about Reed Pharmaceuticals' upcoming FDA approvals, accepting the deferential nods of hedge fund managers who had bought into her narrative wholesale. To this room, Dominic Beaumont was a tragic footnote, a brilliant mind that had unfortunately buckled under the immense pressure of the industry, leaving his capable wife to steer the ship. Zara was mid-sentence charming a skeptical Swiss investor when she noticed a subtle cascading shift in the room's atmosphere. It started near the heavy mahogany entrance doors. A ripple of hushed murmurs spread outward, causing heads to turn and conversations to momentarily falter. The sea of wealthy, powerful executives instinctively parted, creating a narrow, invisible corridor through the crowd. Zara paused, her polite smile freezing in place as she followed the collective gaze. Walking through the parted crowd was a ghost. Dominic Beaumont moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the very air he breathed. The weather-beaten jacket and the hollowed, exhausted look of his Seattle exile were completely gone. He was immaculately dressed in a midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo that cut a sharper, leaner silhouette than anything he had worn during their marriage. His hair was impeccably styled, but it was his eyes that truly stopped the breath in Zara's throat. They were devoid of the warmth she remembered, replaced by a freezing, terrifying serenity. He didn't look like a man recovering from a mental breakdown. He looked like an executioner arriving for his shift. Beside her, Michael's hand stiffened violently against her spine. "Is that—" Michael whispered, the arrogant timbre of his voice completely evaporating. Dominic didn't march toward them. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked to the edge of their social circle, stopping a few feet away. The Swiss investor, sensing the sudden suffocating tension, awkwardly excused himself, melting back into the crowd. The silence between the three of them was louder than the surrounding symphony of the ballroom. Zara felt a cold bead of sweat trace its way down her spine. The heavy crystal of her champagne flute trembled infinitesimally in her grip. She desperately wanted to speak, to assert dominance, to ask him what the hell he was doing here, but her throat had completely closed. The script she had relied on for 2 years was suddenly useless. Dominic met her gaze. He didn't look at Michael at all, treating the VP with the dismissive invisibility of a piece of furniture. He simply looked at the woman who had betrayed him, his eyes scanning the crimson dress, the forced composure of her posture, the hidden terror bleeding into her expression. He raised his glass of bourbon in a slow, deliberate millimeter of a toast. It was a gesture so subtle that no one else in the room could possibly understand its weight. It wasn't a greeting, it was a countdown. Without saying a single word, Dominic lowered the glass, turned perfectly on his heel, and walked away, disappearing into a group of high-profile private equity partners on the far side of the ballroom. Zara remained completely stationary, the crimson fabric of her dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. The music continued to play, the room resumed its low hum, but the foundation of her empire had just cracked wide open. She realized with a sickening plunge in her stomach that her husband had not run away to hide. He had stepped back to take aim. The Boston skyline outside the executive suite was swallowed by a heavy, unseasonal fog pressing against the floor-to-ceiling glass like a wet shroud. Inside, the only light came from the cold blue glare of Zara's dual monitors. The clock on the wall read 2:14 a.m. She stared at the encrypted email from Harrison Vanguard, the private equity firm that had anchored Reed Pharmaceuticals' funding for a decade. The message was maddeningly polite, wrapped in the sanitized jargon of corporate finance. But the core directive was a localized earthquake. Vanguard was indefinitely suspending their commitment to Reed's upcoming Series D funding round. They cited unforeseen shifts in the cardiovascular therapeutic landscape and a need to diversify into emergent, clean-profile biotech. Zara's perfectly manicured fingernail tapped rhythmically against the mahogany desk, a sharp, erratic sound in the cavernous silence. Emergent clean profile biotech. For 3 weeks, ever since Dominic's silent, terrifying apparition at the Pierre Hotel, that phrase had begun circulating through the financial undercurrents of the East Coast. A ghost entity named Aegis Therapeutics was quietly vacuuming up venture capital, promising a revolutionary receptor targeting drug with zero cardiac toxicity. The exact holy grail her own flagship product had failed to achieve. The heavy oak door to the office clicked open. Michael stepped in his tie, discarded, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. The polished, arrogant swagger he wore during the day had dissolved into a restless, irritable exhaustion. He walked straight to the wet bar, the clink of glass and the splash of gin sounding unnaturally loud. He didn't ask how the Vanguard call went. He already knew. 3 more institutional investors pulled back today. Michael said, his voice tight as he took a long swallow of his drink. He leaned against the leather sofa, the shadows accentuating the dark circles under his eyes. They won't say it on the record, but they're hedging. Someone is feeding them projections about this Aegis startup. Projections that make our Phase 3 data look like a liability. Zara didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on the monitor. It's him. We don't know that, Michael snapped, the defensive edge in his tone, betraying his own mounting panic. Aegis is registered through a Swiss holding company. The board is entirely proxy lawyers. There's no trace of Dominic Beaumont anywhere near it. You think Dominic would be stupid enough to put his name on the letterhead? Zara finally turned her chair, her gaze icy and analytical. She looked at Michael, really looked at him, and for the first time she felt a profound, metallic taste of revulsion. When they were sneaking into hotel rooms and stealing moments in the executive elevator, Michael had seemed like a dangerous, thrilling equal. A man of action unburdened by Dominic's rigid moral compass. But now, under the invisible crushing weight of Dominic's retaliation, Michael just looked fragile. He was a man accustomed to riding the waves of success, not surviving a siege. Michael set his glass down too hard on the glass table. He crossed the room and placed his hands on the back of her leather chair, leaning down. We need to counter narrative, he murmured, attempting to inject the old familiar intimacy into his voice. He leaned in to kiss the side of her neck. We release a PR blast about the FDA fast track. We drown out the noise. Zara went rigid. She didn't lean into his touch. Instead, she placed her hand over his wrist and firmly removed his hand from her chair. This isn't a PR problem, Michael, she said coldly, standing up and putting a desk between them. If Vanguard pulls out, it triggers a liquidity clause. The board will demand a full unredacted audit of our clinical trials to reassure the remaining shareholders. The trials you and I altered. Michael's face paled. The romantic illusion of their partnership shattered against the brutal mathematical reality of their crimes. Paranoia, cold and absolute, finally settled into the room. They were no longer lovers conspiring against an oblivious husband. They were 2 thieves trapped in a burning building, both quietly calculating who to push into the flames first. The first blow did not come from a lawyer, a process server, or a dramatic confrontation in a boardroom. It arrived at 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday in the form of a push notification from the financial wall. Zara was in her penthouse kitchen holding a cup of black coffee she hadn't yet tasted. The city outside was still wrapped in the bruised purple hues of early dawn. When her phone vibrated against the marble island, the sharp grinding noise sounded exactly like a bone snapping. She looked down. Breaking whistleblower leaks unredacted Phase 2 data for Reed Pharmaceuticals' flagship cardiac drug. Efficacy questioned. Severe toxicity hid. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. The dark liquid splashed across her bare feet and the pristine white tiles. But Zara felt absolutely nothing. A cold, absolute numbness paralyzed her limbs as she stared at the glowing screen. She picked up the phone, her thumb sliding over the glass to open the full article. It wasn't a hit piece. It wasn't a rumor column based on disgruntled former employees. It was a digital guillotine. The article displayed high-resolution scans of the original unadulterated lab reports, the exact toxicity markers that Chris Baker had identified 2 years ago. The documents were heavily verified, authenticated by independent biochemists the publication had on retainer. The data clearly showed the alarming rate of myocardial degradation that Zara had personally ordered, scrubbed from the final FDA submission. Her phone began to ring. It was the head of PR. She ignored it. It rang again, then the legal department, then her private broker. Within 60 seconds, the screen was a chaotic cascade of missed calls, urgent text messages, and automated alerts. Reed Pharmaceuticals stock was already plummeting, in pre-market trading, a vertical red line diving into the abyss. The penthouse doors burst open. Michael practically sprinted into the kitchen, still half-dressed, his tie hanging loosely around his neck, and his eyes wide with a feral-cornered terror. "Did you see it?" he demanded, his voice cracking, devoid of any of his usual baritone authority. "They published the raw data, Zara, the original baselines. How the hell did they get the baselines? We destroyed the physical hard drives." "Chris Baker," Zara whispered, the realization calcifying in her chest. She looked up at Michael, the illusion of their invincible partnership completely evaporating. "Chris kept a ghost drive, and Dominic found him." "Dominic is a coward," Michael shouted, pacing frantically across the kitchen, his polished shoes crunching over the shattered porcelain. "He doesn't have the connections to broker a leak to the financial wall. He's been living in a cabin for 2 years. "Stop screaming," Zara commanded, her voice dropping to a freezing, lethal register. She walked over to the windows, looking down at the awakening city that suddenly felt like a cage. "He hasn't been hiding, Michael. He's been orchestrating. He waited until we were maximally leveraged, until Vanguard was already spooked to drop the match." Her phone buzzed again. An email from the board of directors demanding an emergency summit at 8 a.m. Zara closed her eyes. The machinery of her own destruction was now moving autonomously, fueled by the undeniable truth of the data. She could call her lawyers, she could draft a denial statement, she could try to smear the publication, but deep down she knew the mathematics of the situation. You could manipulate people, you could manipulate narratives, but you could not manipulate verified third-party scientific data once it was in the wild. "We deny it," Michael stammered, pulling his phone out, his hands visibly shaking. "We say it's a deepfake, disgruntled ex-employee tampering. We sue the publication for defamation." Zara turned to look at him. The panic in his eyes was pathetic. She realized with a sickening clarity that when the federal subpoenas inevitably arrived, Michael would not stand beside her. He would trade her to the SEC in a heartbeat to save his own skin. The empire was burning, the smoke was filling the room, and the man she had destroyed her marriage for was already looking for the fire exit. The oak room at the Fairmont Copley Plaza was a sanctuary of dark wood, worn leather, and hushed discretion. It was exactly the kind of place Dominic Beaumont preferred on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. He sat in a secluded corner booth, a single glass of neat Macallan resting on the coaster in front of him. He didn't need to look up to know she had arrived. He felt the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a sudden jagged current of anxiety cutting through the low murmur of the afternoon patrons. Zara slid into the leather booth across from him. The immaculate, untouchable queen of Boston biotech was gone. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, hurried knot. She wore a dark trench coat, tightly belted at the waist, her face devoid of makeup, revealing the deep, bruised exhaustion beneath her eyes. Her hands resting on the polished table were trembling so violently she had to interlock her fingers to steady them. "It took me 3 days and 2 private investigators to find where you were staying," Zara said, her voice a fragile, raspy whisper. It was a calculated tone, the exact register she used to use when she wanted to evoke his protective instincts. Dominic slowly turned his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. "You could have just asked Chris Baker. He has me on speed dial." The mention of Chris caused a microscopic flinch in her jaw. "Dom, please," she breathed, leaning closer across the table. "I know why you're doing this. I know I broke us. I know the pain I caused you when you found out about Michael. But you are destroying Reed. You are destroying the legacy we built together." "We didn't build a legacy, Zara," Dominic replied. His voice was not angry. It lacked any trace of the bitterness or spite she was so desperately hoping to navigate. It was simply a statement of fact delivered with the terrifying calmness of a coroner reading a report. "You built a crime syndicate. I just finally read the ledger." "It was just one trial," she pleaded, tears rapidly pooling in her eyes. It was a masterful performance blending genuine terror with manufactured remorse. "We were under so much pressure from the board. I made a terrible mistake. But we can fix it, you and I. If you withdraw the Aegis patent, if you issue a statement discrediting the leaked baseline data, we can salvage the stock. I will step down, I will give you the company back. Just don't let them send me to federal prison." She unclasped her hands and reached across the table, her trembling fingers gently covering his. The physical contact was supposed to be the kill shot, the tactile memory of a 5-year marriage designed to shatter his resolve. Dominic looked down at her hand resting on his. He didn't pull away immediately. He simply stared at it as if she had placed a dead bird on the table. "When I left that night," Dominic began, his voice dropping to a low, quiet hum that forced her to lean in even closer. "I didn't leave because my heart was broken. I left because the woman I loved never actually existed." "You are a highly functioning sociopath, Zara. You didn't come here to apologize for the people your drug would have killed. You came here to negotiate a plea deal with a ghost." He slowly, deliberately withdrew his hand from beneath hers. The absence of his touch felt colder to her than the Boston rain outside. "I don't want Reed Pharmaceuticals," Dominic said, reaching into his coat to pull out a $50 bill, dropping it beside his untouched scotch. "And I don't want to punish you. Punishment implies I still care enough to want you to learn a lesson. I just want you to experience the exact consequences of your own mathematics." He stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. "The SEC is raiding your corporate offices at 4 o'clock, Dominic added softly, looking down at her hollow, terrified eyes. "You have about 40 minutes to find a good defense attorney. Michael already secured his an hour ago." He turned and walked out of the Oak Room, leaving her sitting alone in the dim, suffocating silence, completely paralyzed as the final walls of her empire collapsed inward. The 3 massive curved monitors in the penthouse study bathed Zara in a harsh clinical light. She sat paralyzed in her ergonomic leather chair, watching the Bloomberg terminal. It was 3:45 p.m. The market had 15 minutes until the closing bell, but for Reed Pharmaceuticals, time had already run out. CNBC was playing on mute on the wall-mounted television. The breaking news banner was a relentless, glaring red. "SEC raids Reed Pharmaceuticals, HQ, board execs under investigation for clinical fraud." On her center screen, the RDP ticker was in a state of violent collapse. It had opened at $142 a share that morning. It was currently sitting at $18.40, a catastrophic freefall that had triggered 3 separate market volatility halts. Every time trading resumed, the algorithmic sell-offs dumped millions of shares into an abyss with no buyers. Zara watched her net worth, tied almost entirely to equity and stock options, vaporize in real time. The numbers clicked downward with the steady, merciless rhythm of a life support monitor, flatlining. 500 million, 200 million, 80 million. The margin calls had started rolling in an hour ago, automated emails from her wealth managers demanding cash collateral she no longer possessed. Her offshore accounts were already frozen, locked down by the federal injunction Dominic's carefully timed leak had initiated. She was utterly alone. Michael's phone was going straight to voicemail. Her newly retained defense attorney had demanded a $2 million wire transfer. By the end of the day, a sum her bank would no longer clear. The sprawling 70-floor empire she had compromised her soul to build had been reduced to a flashing red line on a black screen. Then at exactly 3:50 p.m., the second wave hit. The financial news anchor on the muted television touched his earpiece, his expression shifting as a new graphic replaced the live helicopter footage of federal agents carrying boxes out of the Reed lobby. The graphic displayed a pristine, minimalist logo, Aegis Therapeutics. Zara scrambled for the remote to unmute the television, her hands numb and clumsy, knocking a pen cup onto the floor. "In a stunning parallel development," the anchor's voice filled the quiet, cavernous study. "A Seattle-based biotech startup, Aegis Therapeutics, has just announced a massive $2 billion Series A funding round, backed entirely by Vanguard and other former Reed institutional investors. Aegis claims their new cardiovascular compound targets the exact same receptors as Reed's embattled flagship drug, but with zero myocardial toxicity. The FDA has reportedly granted them an expedited fast-track status." Zara slowly lowered the remote. 3,000 miles away in a Spartan office overlooking the gray waters of Puget Sound, Dominic Beaumont sat quietly beside Chris Baker. There was no champagne, no triumphant high-fives. Chris simply let out a long, shuddering breath, removing his glasses to wipe his eyes, the weight of 2 years of blacklisted misery finally lifting from his shoulders. Dominic watched the same broadcast, his face perfectly impassive. He reached out and closed his laptop. The surgery was complete. The rot was excised. Back in Boston, the closing bell rang on Wall Street, a sharp metallic toll echoing from the speakers. Reed Pharmaceuticals closed at $4.12 a share. Zara sat in the dimming light of the penthouse. The wealth, the power, the intoxicating rush of the affair, the breathless nights of ambition, it had all been an illusion, a fragile house of glass built over a fault line. She stared at the reflection of her own hollow, terrified face in the dark monitor. Realizing the most devastating truth of all, Dominic hadn't just taken her money. He had erased her from the board completely. The fluorescent lights of the U.S. Attorney's field office in downtown Boston hummed with a sickening, sterile frequency. It was a sound Zara felt in her teeth. She sat at a scarred laminate table in a windowless conference room, the sharp lines of her designer charcoal suit looking absurdly out of place against the institutional gray walls. Her newly retained, obscenely expensive attorney sat beside her typing aggressively on a laptop offering no comfort. It had been 48 hours since the raid. 48 hours of frozen accounts, frantic press releases that no one believed, and a silence from Michael that was louder than the sirens. The heavy metal door clicked open. Michael walked in, followed closely by a man carrying a thick leather briefcase. Michael was not wearing cuffs. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie impeccably knotted. He held a disposable cup of coffee from the lobby downstairs. The sheer mundane normalcy of that coffee cup sent a violent tremor of nausea through Zara's stomach. He didn't look like a man facing the collapse of his life. He looked like a man who had successfully negotiated a severance package. Michael's lawyer placed a single sheet of paper on the laminate table, sliding it toward Zara's attorney. My client has signed a full proffer agreement with the Department of Justice and the SEC, the lawyer stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. He has agreed to provide unredacted testimony regarding the systemic data manipulation orchestrated by the CEO of Reed Pharmaceuticals in exchange for total immunity from federal prosecution. Zara stopped breathing. The air in the small room seemed to instantly vaporize. She didn't look at the paper. She looked up at Michael. She searched his dark eyes for a flicker of hesitation, for the shadow of the man who had pulled her into empty hotel rooms, who had sworn they were building an empire that belonged solely to them. She looked for the passion that had convinced her to leave a platinum ring on a marble counter. There was nothing. His gaze was flat, calculating, and entirely transactional. "You promised them my head," Zara whispered, her voice cracking, stripping away the last remnants of her corporate armor. "I gave them the encrypted voice forum," Michael replied calmly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. "The ones from last October, when we were in Aspen. You specifically directed me to omit the Phase 2 mortality rates before the board meeting." The absolute freezing zero of his confession hit her with physical force. Aspen. The weekend she had told Dominic she was attending a biotech retreat so she could sleep with Michael. He had been recording her. In the quiet intimacy of their stolen moments, wrapped in the sheets of a luxury resort, the man she thought was her partner in crime was actively building a legal kill switch to use against her. Their entire affair hadn't been a grand sweeping romance that defied the rules of a sterile marriage. It had been an acquisition. He had slept with the boss to gain power, and he had kept the receipts to ensure his own survival. "You were building a case against me." She breathed the realization of physical weight pressing down on her chest. "While I was leaving my husband for you." Michael set the coffee cup down. He adjusted his cuffs, a gesture that fleetingly, agonizingly reminded her of Dominic. But where Dominic's silence was a weapon of absolute precision, Michael's betrayal was simply the cowardice of a rat leaving a sinking ship. "We were both playing a game, Zara," Michael said, his tone shifting into a patronizing corporate pragmatism. "You used me to do the dirty work Dominic wouldn't touch. I used you to get the VP chair." The music stopped. "I just found a chair first." He didn't wait for her to respond. He nodded to his lawyer, turned, and walked out the heavy metal door. The latch clicked shut with a deafening finality. Zara remained perfectly still. The attorney beside her was murmuring something about plea bargains and mitigated sentencing, but she couldn't hear him. She was entirely consumed by the echoing emptiness of the room. She had traded a husband who built a fortress for her for a lover who locked her inside it and handed the keys to the federal government. She was finally entirely alone. The morning air in Boston was biting a sharp autumnal chill that signaled the definitive end of the season. Dominic stood on the sidewalk across from the federal courthouse, his hands deep in the pockets of a charcoal overcoat. He looked like any other successful professional navigating the city's financial district, largely invisible to the frantic reporters and camera crews swarming the main entrance. They were waiting for the final sentencing hearing of the most disgraced CEO in the history of Reed Pharmaceuticals. The black SUV pulled up to the curb at exactly 9 a.m. When the door opened, Zara stepped out. She was flanked by two marshals, her movements stiff and mechanical. She wore a simple dark suit, no jewelry, no designer accessories, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. The cameras flashed in a violent, rhythmic strobe, capturing the hollowed-out shell of a woman who had once been the sun around which the biotech world orbited. For a fleeting, microscopic second, Zara's gaze drifted across the street. She saw him. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't offer a smirk of triumph or a nod of acknowledgement. He simply stood there, a witness to the finality of the mathematics he had set in motion. In her eyes, he saw a desperate, flickering hope for a moment of shared humanity, a plea for him to say something to show a spark of the man who had once loved her. Dominic remained perfectly still. He felt no surge of adrenaline, no heat of hatred. He realized with a profound and quiet clarity that the revenge he had meticulously engineered hadn't actually been for her. It had been for the version of himself that had once been foolish enough to believe in her lies. By destroying her empire, he had successfully cremated the ghost of his own naivety. Zara was led up the stone steps, the heavy bronze doors of the courthouse swallowing her whole. She would be facing 7 years in a federal facility, followed by a lifetime of barred executive service and hundreds of millions in restitution. She was for all intents and purposes erased. Dominic turned away before the doors fully closed. He walked 3 blocks to a small, quiet park overlooking the Charles River. Chris Baker was waiting there, sitting on a bench, a set of finalized merger documents for Aegis Therapeutics resting in a leather folder beside him. Chris looked up, his expression cautious. "Is it over?" Chris asked, his voice steady. "It's over," Dominic replied. He sat down, looking out at the rowers cutting through the cold, dark water of the river. "Vanguard sent over the final expansion agreement," Chris said, tapping the folder. "We're opening the Boston Research Hub next month. They want you to lead the keynote at the opening. They're calling it the resurrection of Reed's legacy." Dominic looked at the documents, then at the city skyline that had once felt like his entire world. He thought about the penthouse, the emerald dress, and the silent ring on the marble counter. It all felt like a movie he had seen a long time ago, a story about a man he no longer recognized. "No," Dominic said softly, a faint, genuine smile finally touching his lips. "Tell them Aegis doesn't need a legacy. We'll just focus on the science. I'm taking a few months off. I think I'd like to see what the West Coast looks like when it isn't raining." He stood up and began to walk his stride easy and unburdened. He didn't look back at the courthouse, and he didn't look back at the shadow of the man he used to be. The debt was paid in full, the ledger was closed, and for the first time in years, the silence was finally peaceful.